We're expecting people on site to do so many different things all at once. And to contain all of that in your head, it's impossible. We're very information or document rich in the sector. We're trying to move away from form filling exercises. How can we capture data in a light touch, seamless way that leverages AI? One of the reasons we started QFlow was we wanted to leave the world in a better place than we found it. The built environment overall has a huge influence globally to make that impact.
Imagine if you could take 6% off the cost of construction projects everywhere. Hi, and welcome to Innovation Labs. I'm Jack Lee, and I'm joined by my colleague Grace Newey from Atkins Realis. Today, we're speaking with Jade Cohen from QualisFlow, or QFlow. QFlow's technology can capture real-time insights on carbon and waste directly from the construction site. Hi, Jade. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jade, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at QFlow?
Yeah, of course. So my background prior to QFlow was from the construction industry, and it's really remained at the heart of what we do day to day in terms of trying to prioritize this sector and the users that are engaging with the software itself. So in terms of what QFlow does, so we're sort of software and AI company, been around since 2018, so a number of years now. And what we're trying to do is to help construction companies to better track all of the material movements for raw materials, products, goods being delivered onto live construction or refurbishment sites, and all the waste that's going off. And as you were mentioning, it's used for a variety of different purposes, partly in relation to better cost control, partly in relation to better quality, to make sure that the materials that are arriving are the correct materials according to what was designed or specified initially. And that helps prevent a series of rework or errors that could otherwise occur if the wrong materials arrive and are installed, but also for sustainability purposes as well. And that's been very much core to our mission from day one, is how do we enable the industry to have better data on how it can then start to reduce or put better strategies in place to reduce carbon, embodied carbon, and some of the unnecessary wastage that occurs in the sector as well.
Jade, you mentioned AI a moment ago, and I think this has been a core theme for both Jack and I when we've been having discussions with, some of our other guests on the podcasts. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is exactly how are you leveraging that in QFlow? How are you actually utilising AI to, I'm guessing you're gathering quite a plethora of data from different projects and sites. How are you harnessing that with big data management and AI?
For us, there's a series of different layers to the application. So in the first instance, we have to, we've obviously got the photograph or PDF copy or other format of documentation. In the first instance, we have to lift up the text from that document. And then where AI comes in is then trying to make sense out of all of that text that comes from these documents. And this is where LLMs have been incredibly helpful because obviously using natural language, we can now start to understand what does some of this context mean within the documentation. Can we identify certain product items that are described in various different ways between different suppliers and different documents? And can we use different components or different models to then understand the type of product that this is? And so you kind of got these different layers. So an understanding at the basic level of what the text is showing us, an understanding of interpreting what types of products that these are. And then we're also leveraging AI to try and match some of those products with other documentation that we're finding to then draw in different pieces of context. So if a particular door has been supplied to a site to be installed on a certain level, can we pull in information from the program that determines when that was intended to be delivered or what works package it's in relation to? Can we pull information from the specification to say these are the correct dimensions or grading, or does it have the correct fire rating certification and things like this? And so there's different pockets that we're leveraging it in that help bring the entire product together alongside the platform we built on top of that then surfaces all of that data in a more digestible format for our users, and how they then push that data into other systems, which requires integrations with other tools as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of decision making enablement that comes as a result of doing some of this work, which is really interesting. One of the things I'm also interested in, if you've mentioned there about lifting information out of some of the inputs that you get. how have you found going into the construction sector where you're dealing with, operatives that work in the field who might need support in terms of understanding, upskilling and training in technologies, very used to using paper. I think everyone's aware this sector uses a lot of paper when it comes to site-based stuff. You touched on the fact you've kind of built this around the fact that you know what reality is, right? You know that we're in that situation. It'd be really interesting just to hear your thoughts on how the product's journey has come about in relation to where we are in the sector at the moment.
No, absolutely. And it's such a good point, because you're quite right. Like, there's huge amounts of, whether it's paper-based or just, we're very information or document rich in the sector, but very data poor, I would say, in terms of actually being able to extract insights from that data, which I think is partly the challenge where the industry is trying to apply AI in other areas now, of realizing that actually we don't have the correct quality of data to leverage to get the most out of AI when we're using it for other kinds of purposes. But I think with the way that we've kind of evolved the product over time to adapt to this is, as I mentioned, in the first instance, to try and make it as light touch as possible in terms of the initial data input. We've actually taken on a huge technological challenge, I'd say, in terms of trying to make sense of really complex, messy data. But the intent is to always make this easier on the lives of people on site. And when we look at the general landscape of other sort of software or data collection systems in the industry, there's a lot of form-based systems, so requiring manual input to log certain items or certain bits of information or data. And there's very much a place for that. And that in some instances, you can't capture data in any other way to try and extract information from a human's brain into something more digital. But I think where we didn't want to go down that route for QFlow, because the amount of manual data input that's already required for tracking materials and the amount of material movements that we see coming through, I mean, we've already tracked, over 14 million of these data points. So trying to get humans to try and digitize each one of those pieces is very complicated and very time consuming. So we made it technologically very hard on ourselves, but actually it does mean that from a user perspective, there's incredible light touch, and we're trying to move away from form filling exercises to how can we capture data in a light touch, seamless way that leverages AI, or sometimes doesn't need to leverage AI. You don't need AI for everything, of course. But then that data can then be pumped into other places where it can add more value as well. And so you eliminate, humans can then spend time interrogating, understanding that data and leveraging it to make better decisions, whether it's around waste strategies or minimizing risk on site from avoidable error, or through other mechanisms.
When you two were speaking, I had this image in my head of this like crumpled up form with scribbles on it being handed to you, accompanied by like a truck of materials, and someone having to have a look at that. I don't know what this is. And then trying to then determine, okay, well, do I have the right truck of things, and do I have the right amount of things in that truck? And then it's got like splotches on it or something from, a bit of, water spilt on it. That's just what was going on in my head, right?
No, absolutely. But I think this is part of the challenge outside of the documentation itself, is that we're expecting people on site to do so many different things all at once. It's not just a case of, driving and delivering goods or offloading goods and putting them to the right area or doing it at the right time or doing it safely, to then expect people to have the cognitive energy to then go, are these the correct items according to all these magnitude of requirements that are needed, and to contain all of that in your head? It's impossible. Yeah. And that's exactly why we get errors that happen on site.
So you were starting to talk about some of the things that they could do with that data, right? The insights, kind of waste solutions. Can you maybe talk us through, you have this now insight lifted into a platform. What do people do with it?
No, absolutely. I think in the first instance, and this is kind of the bare bones initially, is that we're starting to see hotspots for certain areas where performance can be improved. So some examples of this will be, some sites we've worked with can identify that certain trades are performing much better than others, let's say. And there might be a variety of reasons for that, but it means that you can start targeting efforts by speaking to those particular trades about a particular works package or material supply, to then try and avoid those common errors or mistakes over the coming months or however long that trade has left on that project. So a problem occurs, you can then quickly stifle it and mitigate it preventing that risk from happening again in the future. We've had other instances where actually there's a great one from quite a few years ago now where uncertified timber or the wrong kind of timber basically had arrived on site for some flooring. And this particular activity was on the critical path. And actually it was highlighted that this was a non-compliant item that had been delivered. And so, they stopped that piece of work. They managed to get reordered with enough time to complete the rest of the critical path activities. But actually what it had inadvertently surfaced was a series of other challenges that were then ongoing with reporting and transparency around that particular trade on site as well. So it's not just used though for identifying the bad stuff. We've also had on the flip side, customers that we're working with who have looked at where waste is being distributed from their sites and identified some really quick wins actually around embodied carbon by looking at closer facilities that can then take waste that weren't surfaced or wouldn't have been surfaced without looking at the data and seeing spatially where things are actually moving to. And so it helps aid both the small decisions that can have knock-on impacts for other areas of performance, but also the bigger risks that we're hoping to allow those contractors to avoid by having that information in a much more live fashion than they would otherwise get access to.
One of the things I'm curious about, and sort of just listening to you talk a little bit about all these different purposes that you can get out of the product, whether that be for sustainability or reuse or gathering data for insights and analytics. One of the things that's obviously close to our hearts in the construction and engineering sector is digital twins, bit of a buzzword, in terms of how we can pull all of these data points together, overlay that with graphical information so we have this virtual physical connection between the world. I was just wondering whether you've got any insights from a digital twin standpoint in terms of where your product sits in that life cycle.
Yeah, it's such a broad space, isn't it? Digital twins.
The word.
Exactly. I know. It's I kind of hear the word. I'm like, oof, okay, digital twins, but not necessarily in a bad way. I think it's it makes complete sense. Have this digital model that reflects the the real life building or asset, whatever it is, because we can run scenarios on it. We can see what happens, both from the operational side, but also during design. So I think, for us, we've always remained pretty agnostic to other systems, softwares, platforms that we kind of integrate with and are and where that data flow can feed. But I think specifically with digital twins, we see if we can get to a position, and we've tried this with some other software platforms already, and I think I'm personally very excited as to what we can do with this over the next 1 to 2 years. But where the data that sits within QFlow exists on a material by material line basis, that forms the evidence of the as-built, right? So it forms the evidence of what's actually gone into that real life building as opposed to what we planned for. And most digital twins suffer with getting information on the reality back in post-design. So we kind of go all the way through the design stage, early concept, detailed design, and then it's really hard to then keep that up to date after that point. But that's where the real benefit comes in from digital twins, because that's when we can start to, again, model out these different scenarios and ways of operating a building. So where we've got the data collected within QFlow so far, we have started pumping that data into other platforms to make sure the data isn't siloed just within QFlow. Now, there are many other components to a digital twin in terms of the data and the information that's needed to be valuable, but certainly the information on what materials exist, where and how much can feed straight back into other platforms. We don't see QFlow as being the digital twin. We see it as a core enabler of other digital twins by providing the data on what's actually gone into that space.
What you said was really interesting about bringing that information back into design. We have a habit in this built environment, ecosystem of just throwing something over the fence, and then saying, "Oh, we're done our part. You take care of that." And then they're kind of saying, "Well, I got to do something with this, but I got to go and do some more work to get this to make it work." And then they throw it over at the end. So in fact, you've got this like incomplete data set, right? And, thinking about things like people get certifications for things like LEED and BREEAM for the materials that they've designed that with. who's actually checking if they've actually used that material in the right quantity? So the actual, they get a certification that is actually old. It's almost like a promised certification rather than, to your point, an as-built, right? And it sounds like you guys can actually tackle that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, BREEAM and LEED and similar schemes have, they've come a long way over the years, and there are some checks and balances to make sure that things are going in as expected. But the problem is, as soon as you surface something that is a problem at that point, it's kind of too late to do anything about it. But I think the biggest change we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly in the UK, is obviously with the Building Safety Act as well, and the golden thread of data, because this legally mandates organizations to have a complete and utter auditable trail of not only the designs, how the designs are changing, but also the decision making process behind it. But then when we're coming into the actual construction phase, to keep a log of everything that's happening and what's going in where. And arguably these are all sensible things that perhaps we should have been doing already, but there are many challenges that are preventing us from doing that. And despite best attempts, there are obviously still challenges that occur, as we've unfortunately seen. But I do think there's going to be quite a step change in the way that we address, in this case, it will be high-risk buildings to begin with. But I do suspect that those requirements and that way of thinking is going to permeate to many other parts of or types of construction.
I think there's probably a lot of collaboration we need to do as an industry across different types of organisations, but I think the tech space plays a massive part of that as well. I think there's been this sort of age-long discussion, especially in the UK, about alliance in contracts and between a construction organisation and engineering design consultancy. There's not really that much talk at the moment about technology companies being a part of that journey. I'm curious to see from your perspective of having done this on construction-based jobs, is there a trend or a correlation on projects which tend to succeed better where they have a more collaborative contractual arrangement than others, from your experience?
The projects that we've seen succeed the most in terms of, and it's not just about the uptake of technology, although that is a component of it, but in terms of their general ability to operate efficiently, is on at least on the construction phase, like early contractor involvement from the design, making sure that there's not a hard line between the different phases of a project, and actually having like early engagement. Obviously, you can only do that within certain bounds, and you can't have everybody in the room all at one point in time, and all the rest of it. But those, especially the bigger schemes, are the more complex ones where you've got early contractor involvement, early supply chain engagement throughout the project. Those are usually the ones where they're able to troubleshoot and tackle problems quicker. And I think this is one thing that always strikes me about the industry in general, is that it's full of problem solvers. But if you chuck problems last minute at people all the time, they become so bogged down by it that you can't kind of see the wood through the trees. So there's always going to be problems that come up, but making sure that there's as streamlined communication and early involvement as possible is important. I do think as well, some organizations we've worked with, you can tell the level of maturity from some organizations in the way they procure technology. So the amount of times we've had to kind of be sort of positioned under a consulting agreement or a subcontractor agreement and go through all these processes that make no sense for a technology company is not just frustrating for both parties involved, because it then takes a lot of time to explain why certain things aren't relevant and everything else. But it also shows the level of maturity around experience in adopting technologies. And if the contractual side is complex and overburdensome, more often than not, you'll find that the integration of that technology within other teams is quite fragmented as well. So those who've gone through the journey, once or more than once, will kind of be familiar with how to take on new technology, culturally, how to get people aligned on the projects, on the schemes, and between different stakeholders and who needs access to data and other things. It's also one of the reasons we don't like charging on a per seat basis, because actually you want as many people to benefit from the same data as possible. But yeah, I think some of those areas are usually kind of key indicators, I'd say, of the projects where we've seen them operate more smoothly than others.
I've definitely been there. When you're talking, I felt your pain. In past life, I was also at a software company, and we were trying to sell into actually a pretty large potential client, and they were trying to get us to be on a consulting contract. And one of the terms of that was they would own all the IP from the work that we do with them, which makes sense from a consulting standpoint. Doesn't make sense if you're the software provider. And it to your point, it demonstrated the lack of maturity around procuring technology, and also kind of gave some warning signs about, even if you were to do a pilot with them, how would that actually work in the long term? How would they scale that? Do they know how to scale technology after they've proven it, in a pilot? So, along that vein, you obviously probably have some battle scars from trying to work with large companies, as a startup, now a scale up, and growing teams. What are some of the success stories and good practice that you've seen? You kind of touched on it already, or maybe to flip it another way, what should companies really avoid doing if they want to be working with startups and SMEs to bring technology into their business?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question in many respects. And I think for companies who are procuring technology or maybe slightly newer to it, I do think, it's not just a one-sided thing. The communication and coordination for onboarding that technology and embedding it goes both ways. So as much as it can be challenging by trying to be shoehorned into some, contractual piece that doesn't really make any sense, equally, it's also our job as technology providers to make sure we're helping those organizations along the way in understanding how to deploy this particular technology, how to embed it, because it is going to be slightly different per technology that you're employing, and you've got the differences between hardware and software and things like this. I think for any organization taking up particularly software, because obviously that's the space we operate in as well, I do think having a sort of clearly coordinated plan in terms of key members within that organization who are accountable for the deployment of that technology. So where the best scenarios we've worked with, where organizations have had certain QFlow champions, for example, and it might be on projects, it might be across different business units, and everybody is fully primed and ready and understanding of what the technology does and how it's meant to work and who needs to be engaged, to then act as those kind of hubs for other people within the organization. So it becomes something that's a little bit more coordinated than just sort of sign the paperwork, get it out, and then it's kind of done. Like, there's still a job. More often than not, there's quite a lot of work that goes into even just signing a contract, for example, with any kind of external firms. And so it's easy to kind of get a bit burnt out by that stage. You kind of forget about the next stage, which is the important bit of actually then using this thing, deploying and getting value out of it. And are there any success metrics, especially if companies are in a phase where they just want to pilot something? Then the best thing I would say is have a really clear idea in mind of what success looks like to you. So when you get to the end of your 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is, what do you need to see to be comfortable that it's returning enough value to you as a business? And it's amazing how many companies don't have a clear idea of that. And that's okay. But the important thing is to then figure out a couple of what those metrics should look like, so that if that's being hit and you're seeing that value, then it makes the decision at the end really easy.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic, especially for me personally, because I do a lot of stuff with deployment and adoption in particular. And I think one of the things that I always find interesting is what are those barriers to adoption. So once you've gone through that initial phase of doing the deployment, you've committed to it, you want to use it, you're going to roll it out and deploy it to the teams. What makes it sticky? What is the value add in all of this, which makes it easy for? You've touched on some of this with this sort of easy use aspect of it. I can imagine is a big factor of that. But what really keeps people hooked on this? With any system, including QFlow, you have to be seeing value, and seeing value ideally on the bottom line. So for us, there's a very strong case with the efficiency around reporting data for things like waste in particular, because it's a nightmare to try and get hold of all the information, go out to your entire supply chain, get all that back in a timely manner, and then try and report on this. So for many people where they're spending, and actually my previous role, I used to do a lot of this myself, know the pain very much firsthand, that it is an absolute nightmare and headache. And you don't want to be spending, every Friday afternoon just going through paperwork, trying to then report on the numbers and make sense of them.
So I think for some people, the stickiness aspect comes in, like they feel more empowered to do other things with their time, more valuable things with their time, that can actually add to the rest of the business rather than focusing on all this, relatively dull stuff.
Jade, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. I'm curious to know, from your standpoint, with the work that you're doing with QFlow as a product that's ever evolving, obviously you'll have innovations that you're trying to do to move that forward. Where do you see things going, A, for QFlow as a product, and B, what are your ambitions for the construction and engineering sector for the next sort of 5 years? What would you like to see?
Yeah, I think, starting with the latter first, one of the reasons we started QFlow was that we wanted to, ultimately leave the world in a better place than we found it. And we believe that the built environment overall has a huge influencing factor globally to make that impact, especially when we know the stats around 40% of carbon emissions come from this sector, and so small degrees of change can have quite enormous consequences in a positive way if we can shift our mindset. And on that thread, actually, one of the things that myself and Brett, my co-founder, are hoping we can get to over the next maybe 5 to 10 years, maybe not necessarily within 5 years, but to a place where as society we can consider construction as adding value back to the world, as opposed to trying to clean up something that is inherently dirty. So how can this thing be a force for good rather than something we're trying to mitigate and reduce in terms of negative impact? And in terms of what that looks like, I think a lot of this comes down to, I'd love to see an unlock for the circular economy in the next 5 years. I don't know whether we'll be in a place where we kind of, again, we go back to this concept of mining the urban environment rather than the natural environment at full swing. But I do think there should be, and we should be in a position where a lot of the materials that we're using for refurbishments and for new builds even as well, a good chunk of those materials should be coming from the existing build stock that we have around us in some fashion. And that's one major change that I would love to see, and think is perfectly feasible over the next 5 years. It's been demonstrated. It's the trick now is really how do we do that at scale? And that's where we require logistics data, people, process, etc. In terms of QFlow and QFlow's part to play in that, so obviously we see ourselves as being, a core data provider to help unlock some of these things in the future. But also in the next couple of years, in order to have that impact, we need to be a global business. So we've always, seen the product as adding value in our domestic market in the UK, but obviously now in other territories. And the way we build the product is going to evolve to better enable that as well in terms of unlocking the circular economy. But in the meantime, our way of doing that is by, we've built a system that can collect the data that's needed in the first instance. So that's good. That's kind of job number one. And then the next step is like, how do we use that data to add value instantly so that we get, so we can add value back to the projects that are live and ongoing, which is where the quality control aspect comes in making sure that we prevent errors, we prevent mistakes. But then all that data can then be resurfaced and packaged in other ways that can add insights across the industry. So understanding average embodied carbon for live buildings or average wastage rates, which we don't have access to at the moment. And then, of course, leading into the piece of, okay, well, now we know where these materials exist. How can we look to repurpose those and gain value back from them?
You were talking about waste, right? And in mistakes and errors, and rework is a big problem for our industry. Estimates, it could be 5-6%, it can be as high as 30%, depending on what what you're talking about. So it is obviously a big problem, and the way I see it, the challenge is it's a very expensive problem. It's wasting a ton of money. That money sometimes will come from private investors and developers, but oftentimes when it's infrastructure, it's kind of public money, it's government money. And I just think about how much could be done with that if we just did it right the first time. So maybe if you could talk about some of the scale of the challenge from what you're seeing, in the sites that you're operating in, and what that actually could mean. Like if we could just save that money and do it right, what that would be able to, what that would unlock for governments to do.
Absolutely. And again, it's funny because small gains can make some massive differences at the scale of some of these big public projects that we have, particularly in infrastructure at the moment. And you actually touched on the stat very early on as well, which was on average, 6% of project budgets are spent on rework and rework associated with problems in the material supply chain. So, which is it's completely avoidable error. This is the thing that always makes me laugh, is that if we can avoid even a fraction of that 6%, let's say, then for public infrastructure projects, which are in the billions and ongoing for decades or more, we're talking huge volumes of capital that at the moment, it's not even a case of if we accelerate this, we kind of gain that back. It's let's not make these mistakes. And suddenly we've got capital to unlock. And it's not a obvious, we've got an extra pot of money here we can now spend. It's we're not going to be pumping more money into something that needs to be, like you said, reworked or caught itself up on. So I think, we can talk about accelerating various things and gaining efficiencies in many different areas, but actually fundamentally, let's stop getting things wrong. And that will help us at least, get a start on getting back on track and hopefully gain some public confidence back in public projects as well, frankly.
So Jade, thanks so much for just speaking to us so far. We're going to try and wrap up now. We'd like to do with all of our guests a set of rapid fire, kind of quick fire questions. So short and snappy, whenever you're ready, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. So first question, what is the greatest invention over the last 50 years that you couldn't live without?
This might be a bit boring, but WhatsApp. Because I can now call my friends halfway around the world, which you couldn't do as easily beforehand. So I think that's a big one for me.
So second question, what's the book that you're reading right now?
So it's called The Art of Not Caring. And it's really about the fact that actually at the moment in modern society, we've kind of progressed so much over, decades and centuries of humanity. But at the moment, there's a huge amount of a sense of hopelessness for many people, especially in the developed part of the world. So it's really around how we kind of find a bit more balance in terms of like what we're kind of gaining from wider life, I would say, but also putting other challenges into perspective as humanity continues to evolve.
And final question, what is the technology that you think is either overhyped or underrated today?
I hate to say this, especially considering what we do, but I think AI feeds into both brackets here. I think it depends on the guys, but I think it can be overhyped in ways where it's not really being utilized, at least not to a super valuable degree. But I also think that there's so much more potential that we're only just scratching the surface on, that we'll see, come to fruition over other months and years as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jade, so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to hear your opinions and thoughts and for sharing them with us. So for our viewers online, if you could please comment below and just, let us know how you're thinking about this topic about sustainability, material waste on construction, and using things like AI to basically try and understand what's happening on the site and extract value from avoiding costly errors, rework, and mistakes. This has been Innovation Labs. Thanks very much. Until next time.